This is a view of the Museum of Science in Boston from the North Point Park. And what I specifically liked about this particular view was the composition. I did take several notes and sketches and took several pictures, but this was the one I liked the best. I also changed it a little bit, as you will see later. There's a strong perspective lines, and that always drives the eye towards a narrative in the painting. But also, what I liked a lot in this summer day was a very interesting contrast of dark and lights. They were really close to each other. Most notable, as you can see, on the bench. It's not the lightest light, but it's almost the lightest light. And of course, the floor there, it's also contrasting with the deep shadow of the bench. But we also have a lot of these contrasting lights in the vegetation. And finally, Museum of Science is in the very back, so it allowed me to play a little bit with atmospheric perspective, not just a linear perspective. I am showing here a disposable paper palette. That's a 9 by 12 palette. And the paints I used was Artisan Winsor and Newton water mixable oils. The order I placed them, as you can see in a very limited color palette, was cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, alizarin crimson permanent, ultramarine blue, and viridian green. The titanium white I like to place a little separate from the other colors. And I also had pre-mixed a violet with alizarin crimson, viridian green, and titanium white because I knew that I was going to use this for the atmospheric perspective. As medium, I used linseed oil, which I place on an upside down marmalade bottle cover. The setup was my first time using my gift to myself, which was a Soho Urban Artist Pochade box artist easel for plein air. I did it in the studio, but it's a wonderful box. As you can see, the setting of the paints that I'm showing you in the previous image is right on the front, on the front of the easel. You can just close it and take it with you. I really like it. It's a very nice box and very affordable. I placed the brushes palette, it comes with the Soho Urban box. You can place it on the right or the left, but because this box opens to the right, I decided to put it on the left. I used filberts and flats on different sizes. Actually, there were two dramatic changes in sizes, either very small or very large, because it's a relatively small painting. The panel is a 12 by 12 MDF panel, which is about 30.5 centimeters by 30.5 centimeters. And I had previously toned it with a rather dark red acrylic. The next step was placing the lines and basically a line drawing, which was very simplified. My recommendation is simplify your shapes, your lines, your drawings, and don't get stuck with details, which is what I used to do a lot. I used the smallest brush I had and a mix of alizarin crimson and viridian green that gives a very nice purple, thin with water. This has no white in it. And just placing very loosely, as you can see, where the composition was going to fit in the panel. Also, the photograph that I had was not square, and I took the liberty of changing some of the things from my photo, using other photos that I had available, and also going on site and making sketches to improve the composition. On this, let's say, first blocking stage, I used the dark greens for where the trees were going to be falling. There's a lot of dark in this particular composition. That is what brings the lights and the contrast with the lights to life. I added the first layer establishing the lightest light on the sky. Now I have to say that because the first layers are thin and this was toned with a rather dark red, which can still be seen through in some areas, it took me about 3 layers to finally get the sky as the lightest light blue that I wanted. I also established where the bridge goes and the Museum of Science, and that's using the violet mix that I had pre-mixed in my palette. The yellow ochre was then used to start noticing the highlights. I really had to hold myself from using the cadmium yellow and the white at early stages, even though it's very tempting. I learned that by first placing the shapes and the darkest areas, then the lights really make the painting come to life. At this stage, I did add ultramarine for the mixes in the darkest areas or shapes on the trees especially, and all the shades is where I'm using the ultramarine blue. The sky and the clouds, as I mentioned, I was using several layers and I wanted to just create a little hint of clouds. What I thought was more important with the sky color was the sky holes not only on the tree, but also on the bridge. And then using the bridge color for more holes on the trees so that it gives the impression of leaves. I loosely defined the back buildings and the bridge. This was basically using colors that are not saturated. So what I mean by this is there's a mix of red violets. So basically either alizarin crimson and Viridian green, which gives a very nice violet, more towards the red or more towards the blue violet using the Viridian green, but all of them have yellow ochre to desaturate them, and also they also have white. To create a more orangey color, I added more yellow ochre to the violet or the gray mixes. I also used the gray mix for the trees on the right, which are farther from the trees on the left. When I painted the railings was basically the Viridian green, and I did use a little bit of yellow ochre and alizarin crimson in different areas. Now for the darkest areas of the railings, I did use a little bit of ultramarine blue in the mix. The dapple lights on the railings are basically just mixing white with Viridian. I was tempted to use more yellow ochre, but it changed a bit the tone of the color of these railings, and I just wanted to keep them like that. And this was the first stage where I decided to start tackling that bench. I did like the red looking through and peeking through, and it's very rough brush strokes with the Viridian green and white. I did add at the corner of the bench a little accent of yellow ochre with very rough brush strokes because it's right by the dark shadow, and I thought that was a good element, visual element in the final painting and composition. At the last stage, I introduced the lights with using a bit of cadmium yellow and white. This increased the contrast and especially using it where I had more dark, especially peeking through the railings. At this stage, I did use the linseed oil for these final brush strokes as an impasto. The final painting is the Museum of Science. It's an original painting by me, and I painted this in 2019. I hope you enjoyed it and you're inspired to paint.